I can tell by the way that you're stirring the drink. Oh, we're already playing with fire. Said that you had to go about an hour ago. Baby, you're such a beautiful liar. It feels like a movie I've already seen. So right now I'm begging you, please. Why don't you save me the trouble? Keep those pretty blue eyes to yourself. Why don't you save me the trouble? Give that heartache to somebody else. If you're the kind of girl that's only gonna wanna love and leave, I gotta need alone in this country tonight. Why don't you save me the trouble? Save me the trouble, baby. Now the closer I get to the red on your lips, I can feel myself falling all crazy. 'Cause just a little kiss and I can never get you out of my mind. So before you go break my heart, why don't you save me the trouble? Keep those pretty blue eyes to yourself. Why don't you save